They thought humans were legends. Then their dangerous warships appeared. The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the bridge of my patrol cruiser, bouncing off metal walls that had never once, in 9 years of service, looked this cold to me. I am Torin Vask, a mid-ranking officer of the Vithari Coalition, and until that moment, my life had been built on quiet routines, empty patrol routes, and stories I never truly believed. Every child of my kind grows up hearing about the vanished species, the ones who fought a war so terrible that entire star systems were left as bare rock, the ones who disappeared afterward, either destroyed by their own hand or hidden so completely that no scanner, no probe, no spy network ever found a trace of them again. We called them many things over the centuries, the silent ones, the screaming world, but the name that stuck, the one parents whispered to quiet, restless younglings at night, was simply this: the humans. I never believed it. Not really. A species that could frighten an entire galaxy into hiding their name behind legend felt like nothing more than a story invented to keep children in their beds. That night, as the alarm kept blaring and my navigator's hands trembled over her controls, I finally understood why the story had lasted so long. "Report," I said, trying to keep the shake out of my voice. My sensor officer, a sharp young Vithari named Ilrin, stared at her screen like it had betrayed her. "Sir, we have a contact. Unidentified. No matching drive signature in any registered database." It just appeared. No engine flare, no jump wake, nothing. One moment there was empty space. The next, there was a ship. Distance? 11,000 kilometers, sitting still, not moving, not hailing, not doing anything at all. I leaned over her shoulder and looked at the readout myself, hoping my eyes would tell a different story than her voice had. They did not. The object on the screen was massive, larger than anything in our own fleet, and its outline defied every design principle I had studied at the academy. No engines visible, no obvious weapon ports, just smooth, dark hull, like something carved from a single piece of stone and then polished until it swallowed light instead of reflecting it. "Could it be a derelict?" asked my second-in-command, an older officer named Bresson who had seen more deep space patrols than anyone else on my crew. "An old wreck drifting through the sector?" Ilrin shook her head slowly. "Derelicts don't have active power signatures, sir. This one does. Whatever it is, it's alive." The bridge fell into a silence that felt heavier than any noise. I had commanded this vessel for 3 years, and never once had my crew gone quiet like that. Fear has a sound of its own, even when nobody speaks, and I could hear it now, humming under the low mechanical noise of the ship's systems. I ordered a full sensor sweep, hoping for answers, and what came back only deepened the unease settling into my chest. The vessel's hull material did not match anything in our records. Its size alone should have made it slow and clumsy, yet its energy signature suggested something far more agile than its bulk implied. And strangest of all, our long-range scanners kept flickering every time they passed over certain sections of the hull, as though the ship itself did not want to be measured. "Sir," Ilrin said quietly, "I'm cross-referencing the hull pattern against historical archives. It's a long shot, but I want to rule something out." "Rule what out?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved across the console, faster now, almost frantic. When the results finally appeared on her screen, her face lost all its color. "It's a partial match," she said, "to an old record, pre-collapse era, before the Coalition even existed in its current form." "A match to what?" She turned to look at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen in another Vithari before. Not confusion, not curiosity, genuine, bone-deep fear. "Human," she whispered. "The database is flagging it as a possible human vessel." I laughed. I could not help it. The sound came out sharp and awkward in the tense quiet of the bridge, and I regretted it immediately, because nobody else laughed with me. Bresson's jaw tightened. Ilrin's hands stayed frozen over her controls. Even the junior officers near the back of the bridge, the ones usually whispering jokes to each other during long patrol shifts, sat in complete silence. "That's not possible," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. "Humans are a myth, a story. They don't exist anymore, if they ever did in the way the legends describe them. This is some kind of sensor error, or a prank, or a new prototype from a rival faction trying to scare border patrols. "Sir," Bresson said carefully, "I want to believe that too. But look at the pattern again. The database isn't guessing, it's matching structural elements from records that predate the Coalition's founding charter. Those records were sealed for a reason. Nobody accesses them without high clearance, and nobody builds ships to match them without a very specific purpose." I stared at the screen, at the dark shape sitting silently in the void, refusing to move, refusing to speak, refusing to explain itself. Every instinct in me wanted to dismiss it as an error, a glitch, anything other than the truth slowly forming in my mind. But there was something about the way that vessel simply existed out there, patient and still, that made dismissal feel foolish. "Hail it," I said finally. "Standard Coalition greeting protocol. Let's see if anyone answers." Ilrin's hands shook slightly as she opened the channel. She read out the standard greeting, the one every Coalition officer learns before their first deployment. Words meant to establish peaceful intent across 1,000 different species and dialects. We waited. The silence stretched long enough that I began to think no reply would come at all, and part of me hoped for exactly that. Then the speakers crackled. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried, speaking in a language none of us recognized, yet somehow understandable in tone if not in words. The way you can tell someone is asking a question, even before you know their language. Ilrin scrambled to run it through our translation systems, and after a tense few seconds, words began to scroll across her screen. "Unknown vessel. State your designation and your intentions in this system." It was such a simple sentence. Direct, almost polite, nothing threatening in the words themselves. But something about the calmness of the voice unsettled me more than any aggressive challenge could have. Whoever, or whatever, had spoken those words did not sound afraid, did not sound curious, did not sound like they were encountering something new. They sounded like someone confirming a fact they already suspected. "This is Coalition Patrol Vessel Asterwing, under the command of Officer Torin Vask," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "We are conducting a routine border sweep. State your designation." Another long pause. My crew held their breath, and I realized I was holding mine too. "Understood," the voice replied. "You may refer to this vessel as the Halcyon. Please confirm your species classification." I frowned at the strange request. In all my years serving the Coalition, no vessel had ever asked for a species confirmation before exchanging basic pleasantries. It was backwards, almost rude by our standards, yet something about the way it was phrased made it feel less like curiosity and more like verification. "Vithari," I answered. "Coalition member species, registered under treaty since the founding charter. May I ask the same of you?" The pause this time felt different, longer, heavier. When the voice returned, it carried the faintest trace of something I could not quite name. Not amusement, not sympathy. Something closer to old, tired recognition. "You may not need to ask," the voice said. "I believe your database has already told you." The bridge went completely silent. Even the low hum of the ship's systems seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I looked at Ilrin, and she looked back at me with wide eyes, both of us thinking the same impossible thought at the same time. "You're human," I said slowly, testing the word in my mouth like it might shatter if spoken too loudly. "Yes," the voice replied, simple and unbothered, as though confirming something as mundane as the weather. "We are." For a long moment, nobody on my bridge moved. The legends I had grown up dismissing as bedtime stories were suddenly speaking to me through my own communication array, calm and patient, waiting for my next words, as if this conversation happened every day. I thought of every story my elders had told me, every warning passed down through generations about a species so dangerous that entire star systems had gone quiet, rather than risk drawing their attention. I had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, twisted by fear and time into something larger than the truth. Looking at the massive, silent shape floating just beyond our sensor range, listening to that calm, unhurried voice, I began to wonder if the stories had actually undersold them. "We were told your species no longer existed," I said carefully, unsure of how much honesty was safe to offer. "That you vanished after the old wars, that there was nothing left." "A reasonable assumption," the voice replied. "We allowed it to become one." Allowed it? We stopped announcing ourselves, the voice said. It seemed wiser, for a time, to let the galaxy believe we were gone. Quiet observation serves certain purposes that loud presence does not. I felt a chill crawl down my spine at those words. An entire species, choosing silence for generations, watching from the shadows while the rest of the galaxy told stories about their extinction. It was not the tale of a broken, defeated people. It was the tale of something patient, something deliberate, something that had made a choice and stuck to it for longer than most civilizations managed to hold a single policy. Why speak now? I asked. Why appear here, in this system, to a routine coalition patrol? The silence stretched again, longer this time, and I sensed that whatever answer was coming would not be a simple one. Bresson shifted uneasily beside me. Ilrin's fingers hovered motionless over her console, no longer trying to gather data, only waiting. Because the quiet is ending, the voice finally said. And it seemed only fair to let someone know before the rest of the galaxy finds out on its own. Those words settled over the bridge like a physical weight. I did not know what they meant exactly, not yet, but I understood enough to feel the shape of the fear building inside me. Something had changed. Something had pulled a species out of centuries of careful silence and placed their warship directly in front of my small patrol cruiser, calmly explaining that the world I understood was about to shift beneath my feet. I looked at the dark, motionless vessel on my screen, no longer just an unidentified contact, no longer just a sensor anomaly to be explained away. It was real. It was here, and whatever it represented, I understood with sudden, complete clarity that my report back to Coalition Command would be the last ordinary thing I did for a very long time. Officer Vask, the voice said, almost gently, you should return to your command structure and deliver a message exactly as I give it to you. Can you do that? My throat felt dry, but I forced the word out anyway. Yes. Good, the voice replied. Tell them humanity remembers the old borders. Tell them we are not here to relive old conflicts. And tell them that whatever comes next, it would serve everyone well to listen carefully, because we will not be repeating ourselves. The channel closed before I could respond. The massive vessel remained exactly where it was for a few more seconds, silent and still, before its hull seemed to fold inward on itself in a way that defied every physical principle I understood, and then it was simply gone. No flare, no wake, no trace at all, as if it had never been there in the first place. I sat back in my chair, staring at the empty space where the ship had been, and realized my hands were shaking. Around me, my crew slowly began to breathe again, glancing at each other with expressions somewhere between disbelief and dread. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, Bresson broke the silence. Sir, what do we tell command? I thought about the calm, patient voice, about the impossible ship that had appeared and vanished without effort, about the quiet certainty in every word that vessel had spoken. I thought about the legends I had grown up dismissing, and how thoroughly wrong I had been to dismiss them. We tell them exactly what happened, I said quietly, and then we prepare for whatever comes next, because I do not think this was a warning we can afford to ignore. Ilrin nodded, already turning back to her console to begin compiling the report, her hands no longer shaking but moving with grim determination instead. I looked once more at the empty patch of space where a legend had proven itself real, and felt, for the first time in my career, truly and completely small. The galaxy had spent generations telling stories about a species that had vanished into silence. That silence, I now understood, had never meant weakness. It had never meant absence. It had simply meant waiting. And now, it seemed, the waiting was over. My report reached Coalition Command faster than any message I had ever filed before, yet the silence that followed felt endless. I sat in the debriefing chamber aboard the regional command station, a cold metal room lit by pale strips of light, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell me what happened next. Ilrin sat beside me, still gripping a data pad she no longer needed, and Bresson stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching the entrance like he expected someone to burst through it at any moment. The officer assigned to review my report was named Counselor Dressa Corin, a senior member of the Sector Oversight Board, and she read through my account 3 times before finally looking up at me with an expression I could only describe as polite disbelief. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that a vessel appeared out of nowhere, identified itself as human, delivered a cryptic warning, and then vanished without a trace, and you have no sensor recording to support any of it." "The recording was corrupted the moment the ship disappeared," I said, trying to keep frustration out of my voice. "We have logs of the contact, the hail, and the conversation transcript. What we don't have is a clean image, because whatever technology that vessel used interfered with our systems the entire time it was present." "Convenient," Corin muttered, setting the datapad down with a soft click against the table. "Officer Vask, I understand that deep patrol duty can be tedious. I understand that isolation sometimes plays tricks on perception, but you are asking me to believe that a species considered extinct for centuries simply reappeared in front of your ship and delivered a vague threat before disappearing again." "It wasn't a threat," I said. "It was a warning. There's a difference." "Is there?" Corin raised an eyebrow. "Because from where I sit, both sound remarkably similar when they come from an unverified source, with no supporting evidence." I felt heat rising in my chest, frustration mixing with something closer to desperation. I understood her skepticism. I had felt the same disbelief myself, right up until that calm voice spoke through my own communication array. But hearing my experience reduced to a symptom of boredom and isolation made my skin prickle with anger. "With respect, counselor," I said, "I have served 12 years without a single disciplinary mark. My sensor officer has an award for precision reporting. My second-in-command has more deep space hours than half this command station combined. None of us imagined this. None of us are prone to exaggeration. Something happened out there, and dismissing it because it doesn't fit comfortably into what we already believe feels like exactly the kind of mistake that gets people killed." Corin studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I am not dismissing your report entirely, Officer Vask. I am telling you that presenting this to the full council without stronger evidence will get you laughed out of the chamber, or worse, will make people question your fitness for continued duty. The idea that humans still exist, let alone that they possess technology capable of appearing and disappearing without trace, challenges everything this coalition has built its threat assessments around for generations." "So what do you suggest?" Bresson asked from the doorway, stepping forward with the calm authority that came from decades of service. "We simply pretend it didn't happen, wait for the next sighting to explain itself?" "I suggest," Corin said carefully, "that we log this as an unverified encounter, flag your sector for increased monitoring, and wait for corroborating evidence before escalating this to a galaxy-wide concern. If this is truly the beginning of something larger, further contact will occur. If it does, we will have a much stronger case to bring before the full council." I wanted to argue further, but something in her tone told me the decision had already been made, regardless of how the conversation continued. I nodded stiffly, gathered my things, and left the debriefing chamber with a knot of unease settling deeper into my stomach. That unease did not fade over the following days. Word of my encounter spread quietly through informal channels, the way rumors always do among people who work closely together for years. Some officers approached me privately, asking careful questions, clearly curious but unwilling to be seen taking the story seriously in public. Others avoided me entirely, as though skepticism might somehow be contagious if they stood too close. Ilrin, to her credit, spent every spare hour combing through historical archives, searching for anything that might explain the vessel's hull signature, the strange voice, the impossible disappearance. She found fragments here and there, old sealed records referencing a species designation that matched what our database had flagged. But most of the detailed files remained locked behind clearance levels far above either of our ranks. "It's like someone wanted this information buried," she told me one evening, frustration evident in her voice as she scrolled through yet another restricted file header. "Every promising lead ends in a wall. Access denied. Clearance required." "It's not just that the records are old, Torin. Someone deliberately sealed them." "Maybe that's the point," I said, thinking back to the calm certainty in that human voice. Maybe an entire species, choosing silence for generations, wasn't only their own decision. Maybe someone here wanted them forgotten too. Before Ilrin could respond, an alert chimed through the station's general channel, sharp and urgent in a way that made both of us freeze. It was not our alert, not tied to our vessel or our sector, but a station-wide broadcast, the kind reserved for events significant enough that every officer needed to hear it regardless of assignment. We hurried to the nearest viewing terminal along with a growing crowd of other officers, all of us crowding around the screen as the broadcast began. The image showed a different patrol sector entirely, 3 systems away from where I had encountered the Halcyon, but the report unfolding across the screen sent the same cold shock through me that I had felt days earlier. Another vessel, another sighting, different crew, different officers, describing an encounter eerily similar to my own, a massive, unidentified ship appearing without warning, hailing the patrol vessel in a calm, measured tone, identifying itself using terminology that matched historical human records. The chamber around me erupted into whispered conversation, disbelief mixing with dawning fear as everyone present began to realize that this was no longer an isolated incident that could be quietly buried under bureaucratic caution. If 2 separate encounters had occurred in different sectors within days of each other, involving crews with no contact or coordination between them, the odds of coincidence collapsed entirely. I found Counselor Corrin later that day in a corridor near the command deck, moving quickly with a small entourage of aides trailing behind her. She looked tired in a way I had not seen during our earlier meeting, the confident skepticism from before, replaced by something closer to controlled alarm. "Counselor!" I called out, catching up to her pace. "I take it you've seen the second report." She glanced at me, and for a brief moment, something like an apology flickered across her expression before her official composure returned. "I have. It appears your encounter was not an isolated incident after all. What happens now?" "Now," she said, slowing her pace slightly, "the full council convenes an emergency session. Your report, along with this new one, will be presented together. I suspect there will be very little laughing this time." The emergency session was called within hours, and I found myself standing before the full Coalition Council for the first time in my career, presenting details of an encounter I still struggled to fully believe myself, despite having lived through it. The chamber was vast, circular, filled with representatives from a dozen different species, each watching me with varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, and barely concealed fear. I recounted the encounter as precisely as I could, careful not to embellish or exaggerate, letting the facts speak for themselves. The silent ship, the calm voice, the impossible disappearance, the warning about ending silence. As I spoke, I watched the reactions ripple through the chamber, disbelief slowly giving way to unsettled recognition, as delegates exchanged uneasy glances with one another. When I finished, an older delegate from a heavily industrialized member world rose from his seat, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. "This is absurd," he said. "The humans are gone. Whatever destroyed their civilization ensured that. This entire narrative sounds engineered, designed to destabilize border confidence right as several territorial negotiations reach critical stages." "With respect," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice, despite the weight of every eye in the chamber on me. "I have no stake in territorial negotiations. I am a patrol officer reporting an encounter that occurred exactly as described. If the council wishes to dismiss it as fabrication, I cannot force belief. But 2 separate crews, in 2 separate sectors, describing nearly identical events within days of each other, is not something easily explained away as coincidence or conspiracy." Murmurs spread through the chamber again, and I could see the argument beginning to split delegates along old familiar lines. Some clung desperately to the comfort of disbelief, unwilling to accept that a species long assumed extinct might still exist, might still possess technology capable of humbling an entire coalition patrol without firing a single shot. Others, quieter and more thoughtful, seemed to be doing the mathematics themselves, weighing the unsettling possibility against the mounting evidence. A representative from one of the older founding species, a calm and measured figure named Delegate Orson, finally spoke, cutting through the rising noise with practiced authority. "Regardless of belief or disbelief," he said, "prudence demands preparation. If there is even a possibility that the reports are accurate, ignoring them carries far greater risk than investigating them. I move that we authorize increased monitoring along affected border sectors, and that we quietly reach out to any historical archives with relevant clearance to determine what, if anything, remains known about human capabilities. The motion passed after brief but heated debate, though I could tell from the divided expressions around the chamber that true consensus remained far away. Belief and denial existed side by side in that room, an uneasy truce rather than a shared understanding, and I left the session with the distinct impression that the council's response, however official it appeared, was still built on shaky ground. That night, back in my quarters, I stared at the ceiling for a long time, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of me. My mind kept returning to that calm voice, the quiet certainty behind every word it spoke. Humanity had chosen silence deliberately, for reasons still unclear to me, and now that silence was ending, not through weakness or desperation, but through some deliberate decision made on their own terms. I thought about the delegates' dismissive anger, about Councillor Corrin's careful skepticism slowly cracking under mounting evidence, about the divided, uncertain response of an entire governing council, faced with the return of a legend nobody had truly prepared for. Whatever was coming, I understood with growing certainty that the coalition's response, fractured and slow as it was, would not be enough to meet it. Somewhere out in the dark expanse between stars, more vessels were likely already moving. More crews were likely already encountering the same calm, patient voice I had heard days earlier. And the galaxy, for all its history and power, remained almost entirely unprepared for what that voice represented. I closed my eyes eventually, though sleep did not come easily, and somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, I found myself wondering not if humanity would return in force, but simply when, and what exactly that return would cost the rest of us. 3 weeks passed before I saw a human warship with my own eyes again, and this time, there was no mistaking what it was. I had been reassigned following the council session, pulled from routine patrol duty, and attached to a special observation task force operating along the outer border sectors, the same region where the second sighting had occurred. Command wanted experienced officers who had already made contact, believing our familiarity with the encounter might prove useful if it happened again. I was not sure whether to feel honored or cursed by the assignment. My new vessel was larger than my previous patrol cruiser, a mixed-crew observation ship named the Pharaoh, staffed by officers pulled from several different coalition member species, all of us thrown together under the command of a seasoned captain named Elena Marsh, one of the few humans still living openly within coalition space, descended from a small diplomatic enclave that had maintained quiet contact with the wider galaxy long after the rest of humanity supposedly vanished. Captain Marsh unsettled everyone aboard the Pharaoh, myself included, though not through any hostility on her part. She was calm in a way that felt unnervingly familiar, carrying herself with the same quiet, measured confidence I remembered from that first voice over the comm channel weeks earlier. When word of the sightings reached her, she had not seemed surprised at all, only thoughtful, as though she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. "They're not lying," she told me privately during my first days aboard, when I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly what she believed. My family has known for generations that most of humanity never actually disappeared. We simply stopped being visible. There's a difference, and it's an important one. Why would an entire species choose to stay hidden for that long? I asked. What could possibly be worth that kind of sacrifice? Marsh considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because the last time humanity was fully visible to this galaxy, it nearly destroyed us. Not through defeat, Officer Vask. Through fear. Every species that encountered us reacted with such overwhelming hostility that survival eventually meant convincing everyone we were gone. It worked, for a very long time. But quiet strategies rarely last forever, especially when the reasons behind them start to change. I wanted to ask what those reasons were. What exactly had shifted enough to bring human warships out of centuries of careful silence? But before I could press further, an alert from the bridge interrupted us, calling both of us forward at once. What we found waiting for us on the primary view screen stole the words from my throat entirely. It was not one ship this time, but 3, positioned in a loose triangular formation just beyond the edge of our sensor range, each one massive, dark, and unmistakably human in design. Unlike the Halcyon, which had appeared and vanished almost playfully, these vessels made no effort to hide their presence. They sat in open space, deliberately visible, weapon systems powered but not aimed, engines idling with a barely contained energy that made my own ship's sensors strain just trying to measure their output. "Report," Captain Marsh said, her voice steady despite the tension gripping the rest of the bridge crew. Our sensor officer, a nervous young thrall named Padrick, struggled to keep his voice level as he read out the data scrolling across his console. "3 vessels, Captain. Configuration matches historical human warship designs, though significantly advanced beyond anything in our archives. Power output alone dwarfs our entire task force combined. They're not moving, they're not hailing, they're just watching." I stepped closer to the view screen, studying the 3 shapes hovering silently in the void. Unlike the smooth, almost organic curves of the Halcyon, these vessels carried sharper, more angular lines, clearly built with function over elegance in mind. Weapon emplacements dotted their hulls, visible even at this distance, though none of them showed any sign of active targeting. "They're not here to attack," Marsh said quietly, almost to herself. "If they wanted a confrontation, we would already know it." "This is a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" I asked. "Capability," she said simply, "and restraint." Before anyone could respond further, our communication array crackled to life on its own. No hail required from our side. The same calm, measured tone I remembered from weeks earlier filled the bridge, though this time it carried an edge of formality that made it clear this was no casual conversation. "Coalition vessel Pharaoh. This is Fleet Commander Daniel Ashworth, of the Human Border Division. We are aware of your task force's presence and purpose in this sector. You are not currently in danger. Please maintain your current position and refrain from any offensive action." The bridge crew exchanged tense glances, and I noticed several officers instinctively reaching toward weapon controls before catching themselves, remembering the clear instruction not to escalate. Marsh raised a hand, signaling everyone to stand down completely, and stepped forward to respond herself. "This is Captain Elena Marsh of the Pharaoh, acting under Coalition authority," she said. "We acknowledge your presence and confirm no offensive action will be taken. May I ask the purpose of this formation?" There was a brief pause before Commander Ashworth's voice returned, still calm, still unhurried. "Confirmation, Captain Marsh. We wanted to ensure the Coalition understood the scale of what has returned to this region of space, rather than relying solely on second-hand reports from isolated encounters. Numbers tend to carry more weight than a single anecdote." I felt a chill settle over me at those words, understanding immediately what the demonstration truly represented. This was not a display of aggression, not an opening move toward conflict, but something far more calculated. 3 warships, sitting silently in open space, were enough to make an entire task force freeze in place without a single shot being fired. If 3 vessels alone commanded this much caution, I could hardly imagine what a full deployment might accomplish. "Your point has been made," Marsh said carefully. "May I ask what the Coalition should expect moving forward? Further sightings? Formal contact? Some indication of intent would go a long way toward preventing unnecessary escalation on either side." Another pause, longer this time, before Ashworth's voice returned with something that almost sounded like genuine consideration behind it. "Formal contact will occur, Captain Marsh, through appropriate diplomatic channels, in time. For now, understand that human presence in this region is no longer something to be debated or dismissed. We are not seeking conflict, but we will not return to silence either. The circumstances that once required our absence no longer apply, and pretending otherwise serves no one." "What circumstances?" I asked before I could stop myself, stepping closer to the comm array despite my lower rank giving me little right to interject in a conversation between a captain and a fleet commander. There was a brief pause, and I wondered if I had overstepped badly enough to draw a sharp rebuke. Instead, Ashworth's voice returned, and though I could not see his face, something in his tone suggested he had recognized my voice from our earlier encounter weeks before. "Officer Vask," he said, and I felt a jolt of surprise at being addressed by name. "I believe we have spoken before, through my colleague aboard the Halcyon. You asked a similar question then, and the answer remains the same. The quiet is ending, because the threats that once justified it no longer require our silence to remain contained. What comes next depends heavily on how the wider galaxy chooses to respond to our return." That sounds like a warning, Marsh said carefully. It is an honest statement, Ashworth replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Humanity does not intend to repeat old conflicts. But we will not hide from a galaxy that no longer requires our absence, and we will not apologize for the strength we've built during the centuries we spent unseen. How the Coalition chooses to interpret that strength is, ultimately, your decision to make. The channel closed shortly after, and the three vessels remained in position for several more tense minutes, before finally powering their engines and departing, not vanishing instantly like the Halcyon had, but withdrawing at a controlled, deliberate pace, as though wanting to be seen leaving just as clearly as they had been seen arriving. The bridge remained silent long after the ships disappeared from sensor range, everyone processing what had just occurred. I looked over at Captain Marsh, searching her expression for some indication of how deeply this encounter had unsettled her, but found only quiet, thoughtful resolve instead. "They're not bluffing," she said finally, addressing the crew as much as me. "And they're not hiding their strength anymore. Whatever brought them out of hiding, it was significant enough to outweigh centuries of careful caution. That should concern all of us far more than any single warship ever could." I thought about Commander Ashworth's words, about circumstances no longer requiring silence, about threats supposedly once contained by humanity's absence. Something larger was moving beneath the surface of this entire situation, something none of us fully understood yet, and the demonstration we had just witnessed felt less like an ending and more like the opening notes of something far bigger. As the Pharaoh began preparing to relay our report back to Coalition Command, I found myself staring at the empty patch of space where 3 human warships had calmly, deliberately reminded an entire task force exactly how outmatched we truly were, without ever needing to fire a single weapon. The legends had returned, and for the first time, I understood with complete clarity that the stories my elders told had never come close to capturing the truth. The report from the Pharaoh reached Coalition Command within hours, and this time, there was no debate about whether the encounter was genuine. 3 human warships, witnessed by an entire mixed-species crew, verified through multiple independent sensor logs, left no room for the kind of comfortable denial that had followed my first encounter weeks earlier. What followed instead was something closer to panic, dressed up as procedure. I found myself summoned back to the Central Command Station for a second emergency council session, this one far larger and more chaotic than the first. Delegates from nearly every member species crowded the chamber, along with military advisors, intelligence officers, and diplomatic staff, all speaking over each other in a rising tide of anxious debate before the session had even officially begun. Captain Marsh sat beside me during the proceedings, invited to speak given her unique position as a human still living openly within Coalition space. Her presence alone seemed to unsettle several delegates, who kept glancing toward her with expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and unease, as though her calm demeanor confirmed everything unsettling about the reports they had just received. Councillor Corrin opened the session, her earlier skepticism entirely gone, replaced by a grim, businesslike focus that suggested she had spent the past weeks quietly preparing for exactly this moment. "We no longer have the luxury of debating whether these encounters are genuine," she said, addressing the full chamber. "The evidence is conclusive. Our focus now must shift entirely toward understanding what this means for Coalition security, and how we intend to respond." A representative from one of the more heavily militarized member worlds rose immediately, his posture rigid with barely restrained aggression. "Respond how, Counselor? With what? Our combined fleet strength cannot match even a fraction of what was demonstrated in that sector. If humanity intends conquest, there is little any of us can do to prevent it." "There is no evidence of hostile intent," Marsh interjected calmly, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her. "Every encounter reported so far has involved careful restraint, deliberate communication, and no offensive action whatsoever. If humanity wanted conquest, Counselor, believe me, none of us would be sitting here debating the appropriate response. We would already know the outcome." Her words carried a quiet weight that silenced the chamber for a moment, though the underlying tension remained. Another delegate, an older representative from a founding member species, spoke next, her voice measured but pointed. "With respect, Captain Marsh, your perspective is understandably biased given your heritage." We require assessments free from personal loyalty, particularly given how little the wider galaxy actually understands about current human capabilities or intentions. Marsh did not flinch at the accusation, though I noticed her jaw tighten slightly before she responded. My heritage gives me insight, not bias. I have spent my entire life within Coalition space, serving under Coalition command, holding Coalition citizenship. If anything, my perspective offers a bridge this council desperately needs right now, rather than a liability to be dismissed. The debate continued in this fashion for what felt like hours, delegates splitting along familiar lines of fear, caution, aggression, and reluctant curiosity, none of them reaching anything close to consensus. I sat quietly through most of it, watching the same pattern of denial and panic play out that I had witnessed during my first report weeks earlier, except now amplified across an entire governing body, instead of contained within a single skeptical counselor. Eventually, Delegate Orson, the calm founding species representative who had pushed for increased monitoring after my initial report, rose to address the chamber directly. "We are wasting valuable time arguing about intent when we possess almost no actual information to base those arguments on," he said. "I propose we pursue direct diplomatic contact, rather than continuing to react blindly to isolated sightings. If humanity has chosen to end their silence, as Officer Vask's reports suggest, then the wisest course of action is to open genuine communication before fear and speculation push us toward a conflict none of us can afford." Murmurs of agreement mixed with skeptical resistance rippled through the chamber, but after another round of tense debate, the motion for formal diplomatic contact passed by a narrow margin. Given her unique background, Captain Marsh was formally appointed to lead the initial diplomatic effort, with myself assigned as liaison officer given my direct history with the encounters, and Ilrin reassigned once again to support our communication and translation needs. The assignment felt simultaneously like an honor and a burden heavier than anything I had carried before. As the session finally adjourned, delegates filing out of the chamber still murmuring among themselves, Marsh found me near the exit, her expression unreadable. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "Most officers would have stayed silent through the entire debate. I'm not sure staying silent was ever an option," I admitted. "Not after everything I've seen these past few weeks." She studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then you understand why this diplomatic mission matters so much. If we manage this correctly, we prevent a conflict that could devastate both sides. If we manage it poorly, we might trigger exactly the kind of confrontation everyone in that chamber fears." "No pressure," I muttered, and for the first time since our encounter weeks earlier, I saw something close to genuine amusement flicker across her face. "Very little," she agreed. "Get some rest, Officer Vask. We depart within 2 days, and I suspect neither of us will be sleeping much once this mission begins." 2 days later, our small diplomatic vessel, escorted by a modest coalition security detail, departed toward the coordinates provided, through an encrypted channel, following Marsh's formal request for contact. The journey itself passed in tense quiet, every member of our small crew acutely aware of the significance riding on this mission, though few of us spoke openly about the weight pressing down on all of us. Ilrin spent most of the journey buried in preparation, reviewing every scrap of historical data she could access, cross-referencing linguistic patterns, cultural context, anything that might help us navigate a negotiation with a species none of us truly understood, despite generations of stories and legends surrounding them. I found myself unable to focus on similar preparation, my mind instead replaying every detail of my 2 previous encounters, searching for clues about what kind of reception awaited us. When we finally arrived at the designated coordinates, I expected another demonstration similar to the one witnessed by the Pharaoh, perhaps an even larger show of force, meant to remind us exactly how outmatched we remained. Instead, we found a single vessel waiting for us, smaller than the warships from previous encounters, configured more for transport and communication than combat. "That's unexpected," Bresson murmured beside me, studying the readout with visible confusion. I anticipated something considerably more intimidating. "Perhaps that's the point," Marsh said thoughtfully. "A single vessel sends a different message than a fleet. It suggests confidence rather than intimidation. They don't need to overwhelm us to prove their capability. We already know it." A hail came through moments later, and this time, The voice that greeted us was different from both previous encounters. Younger, more measured, carrying a formal diplomatic tone that suggested careful preparation on their end as well. Coalition Diplomatic Vessel. This is Ambassador Grace Whitfield, representing the Human Diplomatic Council. We welcome your delegation and invite Captain Marsh, along with designated liaison officers, to proceed to our vessel for formal discussion. Marsh glanced toward me, a silent question passing between us, and I nodded despite the nervous knot tightening in my stomach. Whatever came next, we had spent weeks working toward exactly this moment, and retreating now was no longer an option worth considering. Understood, Ambassador Whitfield, Marsh replied. We accept your invitation, and will proceed accordingly. As our small shuttle detached from the main vessel and began its approach toward the waiting human ship, I found myself staring out at the massive, dark hull, growing larger in our viewport, thinking back to every legend, every whispered childhood story, every skeptical dismissal I had encountered over the past several weeks. None of it had prepared me for the reality of what waited ahead, and as our shuttle finally docked, the airlock cycling open to reveal a corridor lined with quiet, watchful figures dressed in unfamiliar uniforms, I understood with complete certainty that whatever happened next would shape the future of an entire galaxy, one careful word at a time. The corridor inside the human vessel felt strangely ordinary despite everything I had expected. No looming threats, no displays of dominance, just clean, efficient hallways lined with quiet crew members who watched our small delegation pass with polite curiosity rather than hostility. Ambassador Grace Whitfield met us personally near the entrance, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an easy, professional smile that immediately put me slightly more at ease. Captain Marsh, Officer Vask, she said, extending a hand toward each of us in turn, a gesture Marsh returned easily while I fumbled slightly through the unfamiliar custom. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I understand this entire situation has created considerable uncertainty across the coalition. We hope this meeting helps address some of that. That's certainly our hope as well, Marsh replied. Though I suspect there's a great deal more uncertainty to work through before either side feels fully settled. Whitfield's smile turned slightly wry. An honest assessment. Please, follow me. Fleet Commander Ashworth is waiting, along with several members of our diplomatic council. We followed her deeper into the vessel, passing through sections that felt almost deceptively familiar, communication hubs, living quarters, briefing rooms not entirely unlike those found on coalition ships, save for subtle differences in design philosophy that spoke to centuries of separate development. Ilrin walked close beside me, her eyes darting everywhere, clearly cataloging every detail for later analysis, though she remained admirably composed given the weight of the moment. We were led into a spacious meeting chamber, its walls lined with soft lighting and minimal decoration, centered around a long table where several figures already sat waiting. I recognized Commander Ashworth immediately, his calm, measured presence matching the voice I remembered from our earlier encounter. Beside him sat two other officials, along with a younger man near the far end of the table, who watched our arrival with sharp, evaluating eyes. Captain Marsh, Ashworth said, rising slightly as we entered. Officer Vask, it's good to finally speak face-to-face, rather than through comm channels alone. Likewise, Commander, Marsh replied, taking the offered seat across from him, while the rest of us settled into the remaining chairs around the table. For a moment, nobody spoke, the weight of the occasion settling heavily over the room. Finally, Ashworth broke the silence, his tone shifting into something more formally diplomatic. I imagine your council has many questions, Captain Marsh, and we intend to answer as honestly as circumstances allow. Perhaps it would help to begin with the question weighing most heavily on everyone's mind. Why now? Why end centuries of careful silence at this particular moment? Marsh nodded slowly. That would certainly help ease considerable tension back home, yes. Ashworth exchanged a brief glance with the younger official beside him before continuing. The silence we maintained was never about weakness, nor was it born from defeat, despite what legend may have suggested across the galaxy. It was a deliberate strategic choice, made generations ago, when early contact with several coalition predecessor states resulted in conflicts far more destructive than either side anticipated. Rather than continuing a cycle of escalation neither species could sustain indefinitely, humanity chose a different path. We withdrew from visible contact entirely, focusing instead on internal development, careful expansion into unclaimed regions, and quiet observation of galactic affairs from a distance. For centuries? I asked, unable to fully process the scale of patience such a strategy required. For centuries, Ashworth confirmed. It allowed old grievances to fade, allowed new generations to grow up without direct memory of past conflicts, and allowed us to develop technology and infrastructure without external interference or competition. It was, by most measures, remarkably successful. Then why abandon it now? Marsh asked. What changed? The younger official at the far end of the table spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that immediately drew everyone's attention. Because a threat has emerged that no single species can safely ignore, regardless of past strategy. One that our continued silence would only make more dangerous to address. The room fell into tense quiet at his words. Marsh leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening with focused attention. What kind of threat? Ashworth answered instead, his tone growing more serious. Roughly 2 years ago, our deep observation networks detected unusual activity along the far eastern edge of charted space, well beyond current coalition borders. Initial reports suggested nothing more than natural phenomena, but subsequent investigation revealed something considerably more concerning. An expanding force, non-native to this galaxy entirely, has begun systematically absorbing smaller star systems along the outer rim, consuming resources and population centers with efficient, almost mechanical precision. Absorbing, Ilrin repeated carefully. You mean conquest? More than conquest, the younger official said grimly. Conquest implies eventual governance, eventual integration. What we've observed suggests complete consumption instead. Entire systems, stripped of resources and population, left as lifeless husks within weeks of initial contact. No negotiation, no attempt at communication, simply systematic, efficient destruction. The chamber fell utterly silent, the weight of those words settling over everyone present. I thought of every threat assessment I had studied during my training, every scenario prepared for potential coalition conflicts, and realized none of them had ever accounted for something operating with such complete disregard for negotiation or restraint. How long before this threat reaches coalition space? Marsh asked quietly. Current projections suggest between 18 months and 3 years, depending on the rate of expansion and which direction their advance ultimately favors, Ashworth said. It was this timeline, more than anything else, that forced our hand. Continued silence would have left the coalition, along with every other regional power, completely unprepared for a threat none of you currently possess the awareness or coordination to address effectively. I felt a chill settle deep into my chest, understanding now the true weight behind every calm, measured warning delivered across our previous encounters. Humanity had not returned out of aggression or ambition, but out of necessity, recognizing a danger significant enough to outweigh centuries of carefully maintained caution. Why not simply share this information through diplomatic channels from the start? I asked. Why the demonstrations, the warships, the deliberate displays of strength? Ashworth's expression turned faintly apologetic. Because information alone rarely moves governments quickly enough, Officer Vask. Demonstrating capability first ensures that when the full threat assessment is shared, it carries the weight necessary to prompt genuine action rather than getting buried beneath the same bureaucratic hesitation that nearly cost your own council valuable time following your initial report. The pointed accuracy of that observation stung slightly, though I could not argue against it. I thought of Councillor Corrin's early skepticism, of the divided, chaotic council session that followed my first encounter, and understood exactly how much time might have been lost without the undeniable proof 3 human warships had provided. What exactly are you proposing then? Marsh asked, steering the conversation toward more immediate practical concerns. Cooperation? Alliance? Something else entirely? Cooperation, at minimum, Ashworth said. Shared intelligence, coordinated defense preparation, and eventually, if circumstances allow, a unified response strategy, capable of meeting this threat before it reaches populated coalition territory. We are not asking for control over coalition forces, nor do we intend to impose ourselves as some singular saving power. We simply recognize that facing this threat divided, offers considerably worse odds than facing it together. Marsh sat quietly for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of everything just shared. Finally, she nodded slowly. I cannot authorize a formal alliance on behalf of the Coalition Council, Commander. That authority rests well above my position, but I can, and will, carry this information back with the strongest possible recommendation for serious consideration. That is all we ask for now, Ashworth said. Time is limited, but not yet critical. We would rather build genuine cooperation carefully than rush into an arrangement neither side fully trusts. As the meeting continued, moving into more detailed discussion of intelligence sharing protocols and preliminary coordination frameworks, I found myself quietly processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. The legends I grew up dismissing, the warships that had shattered every assumption I once held about humanity's fate, none of it had prepared me for the true shape of the danger now looming over the entire galaxy. Humanity had not returned as conquerors, nor as vengeful ghosts emerging from old grievances. They had returned as reluctant guardians, forced out of careful silence by a threat too significant to face alone, carrying warnings that the rest of the galaxy desperately needed to hear, whether we were ready to listen or not. As our meeting finally drew toward its close, Ashworth rose from his seat, extending a hand toward Marsh, in a gesture of cautious, careful partnership. I hope this marks the beginning of something the galaxy sorely needs, Captain Marsh. Cooperation, rather than conflict. Marsh shook his hand firmly, her expression resolute, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her after such an intense exchange. So do I, Commander. So do I. As we made our way back toward our shuttle, the weight of everything revealed pressing heavily on my thoughts. I found myself staring back one final time at the quiet, unassuming figures, moving purposefully through the human vessel's corridors, and understood with complete clarity that the true nightmare threatening the galaxy had never truly been humanity itself. It was what lay waiting beyond its borders, patiently expanding, utterly indifferent to negotiation, drawing steadily closer with every passing day. Word of the true threat spread through Coalition Command with an urgency that no amount of bureaucratic caution could slow this time. Within days of our return, another emergency session convened, though this one carried a very different atmosphere than the chaotic, disbelieving sessions that had followed my earlier reports. Fear had replaced skepticism entirely, and fear, I quickly learned, moved governments far more efficiently than careful diplomacy ever could. I stood once again before the full council, this time alongside Captain Marsh, presenting the detailed intelligence shared during our meeting aboard the human vessel. The chamber listened in complete silence as we described the expanding threat along the galaxy's far eastern rim, the systematic consumption of entire star systems, the grim timeline suggesting Coalition territory itself would face contact within a matter of years rather than decades. When we finished, the chamber remained quiet for a long, heavy moment before Councillor Corrin finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the skepticism from our earlier encounters. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "If this intelligence proves accurate, the question is no longer whether we can afford to cooperate with humanity. It's whether we can afford not to." Delegate Orson rose next, his expression grim but resolute. "I move that the Council formally authorize expanded diplomatic engagement with the human delegation, including shared intelligence protocols and preliminary defensive coordination, effective immediately. Further delay serves no purpose beyond increasing our vulnerability." The vote that followed passed with an overwhelming majority, a sharp contrast to the divided, contentious debates that had defined every previous session. Even the delegates who had once dismissed my reports as fabrication or propaganda now sat in tense, focused silence, clearly grappling with the reality that survival, not pride or old grievances, needed to guide the Coalition's next steps. Over the following months, I watched the relationship between humanity and the Coalition shift rapidly from cautious suspicion toward genuine, if still uneasy, cooperation. Joint intelligence briefings became routine. Coordinated border patrols began integrating human observation techniques alongside traditional Coalition methods. Slowly, carefully, trust began building between two civilizations that had spent centuries separated by fear, legend, and misunderstanding. Captain Marsh found herself increasingly central to these efforts, her unique position as both a coalition officer and a member of humanity's diplomatic community, making her an invaluable bridge between the two sides. I remained attached to her team as liaison officer, watching with growing respect as she navigated the delicate balance of building trust without compromising coalition interests, all while maintaining honest, transparent communication with Commander Ashworth's diplomatic council. During one particularly long coordination session aboard a shared command outpost near the border, I found myself alone with Ashworth for the first time since our initial diplomatic meeting, both of us taking a brief respite from the ongoing planning sessions that had consumed most of our recent weeks. "You seem more at ease than when we first spoke," Ashworth observed, settling into a chair across from me in the quiet observation lounge, the stars stretching endlessly beyond the viewport behind him. "I suppose I've had time to adjust," I admitted. Though I doubt anyone fully adjusts to learning their childhood legends were real, let alone discovering an even larger threat waiting beyond them. Ashworth allowed a small, tired smile. "No, I imagine not. For what it's worth, Officer Vask, your initial report carried far more weight than you probably realized at the time. Encounters like yours, brief and unverifiable as they seemed, were exactly the kind of careful first contact we hoped for. Enough to plant doubt in comfortable assumptions, without triggering immediate panic. It didn't feel particularly careful from where I stood," I said dryly. "Mostly, it felt terrifying." "Fair," Ashworth said, chuckling softly. "Diplomacy rarely feels as controlled from the receiving end as it does from the side orchestrating it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, before I found myself asking the question that had lingered in my mind since our first formal meeting. "Do you believe this cooperation will hold? Once the immediate fear fades, once old suspicions have time to resurface, will the coalition and humanity actually stand together against whatever is coming?" Ashworth considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't know, honestly. Cooperation born from fear tends to be fragile once the immediate danger passes, but I choose to believe that shared survival creates a foundation stronger than old grievances, provided both sides remain willing to build on it honestly, rather than retreating back into comfortable isolation the moment the crisis feels less immediate." His answer felt honest rather than reassuring, which somehow made it easier to accept. I had learned enough over these past months to understand that easy answers rarely reflected the true complexity of what we now faced. As the weeks continued, reports from deep observation posts along the galaxy's eastern rim grew steadily more concerning. The expanding threat, still poorly understood despite humanity's more advanced observation network, continued its relentless advance, consuming star systems with the same efficient, indifferent precision described during our initial briefing. Coalition and human forces alike scrambled to accelerate joint defensive preparations, recognizing that whatever timeline had initially been projected might prove far too optimistic. During one tense joint briefing, new intelligence revealed something that sent a fresh wave of dread through everyone present. The expanding force had begun exhibiting signs of accelerated growth, consuming systems at a pace nearly double previous estimates, suggesting either technological advancement on their part or simply a deliberate strategic shift toward faster expansion. "At this rate," a human intelligence officer explained grimly during the briefing, "contact with coalition border territory could occur within 12 months, possibly sooner, depending on which direction their advance ultimately favors." The room fell into tense silence at this revised timeline, the weight of accelerated urgency settling heavily over both human and coalition officers alike. Marsh exchanged a grim glance with Ashworth before addressing the room directly. "Then our preparation timeline needs to accelerate accordingly," she said firmly. "We cannot afford further delay, regardless of remaining political hesitation on either side." The following weeks became a blur of intensified activity, joint training exercises, shared technology development, and accelerated fortification of border sectors most likely to face initial contact with the advancing threat. I found myself working longer hours than ever before, coordinating between coalition command structures and human liaison teams, watching firsthand as two civilizations once separated by centuries of fear and legend gradually began functioning as genuine allies, however uneasy that alliance still remained beneath the surface. Ilran, working closely alongside human linguistic and intelligence specialists, made remarkable progress developing more efficient translation and communication protocols between our respective forces, significantly improving coordination efficiency during joint exercises. Bresson, meanwhile, found himself increasingly respected among human military officers for his decades of deep patrol experience, his practical insight proving valuable during defensive strategy sessions. Despite the mounting urgency and accelerating timeline, I found myself feeling something unexpected amid all the tension and uncertainty. Hope. Fragile, cautious hope, but present nonetheless. Watching coalition and human officers work side by side, gradually building genuine trust through shared purpose rather than forced necessity alone, I began to believe that perhaps Ashworth's earlier words carried more truth than either of us had initially dared hope. Perhaps shared survival truly could build something stronger than old fear and legend ever had. Still, as reports continued arriving from the eastern observation posts, each one carrying grimmer news than the last, I understood clearly that whatever fragile foundation we managed to build together would soon face its ultimate test. The threat advancing steadily toward coalition space cared nothing for diplomacy, nothing for careful trust building, nothing for the delicate balance we had worked so hard to establish over these past months. It simply continued its relentless, indifferent advance, drawing ever closer with each passing day, utterly unconcerned with whatever alliance humanity and the coalition managed to forge in response. And somewhere deep within me, beneath the cautious hope and determined resolve, a quiet unease remained, whispering the same uncertain question that had followed me since that very first encounter weeks earlier. Would it be enough? 10 months after our first joint briefing revealed the accelerated threat, I stood aboard a combined command outpost near the newly established defense line, watching coalition and human vessels move in coordinated formation across a view screen that stretched the length of an entire wall. What had once been separate fleets, distrustful and unfamiliar with each other's methods, now functioned as something closer to a single, unified force, forged through months of shared preparation and mounting urgency. The threat had not slowed. If anything, recent reports suggested its advance had accelerated further still, consuming systems along the eastern rim with an efficiency that left even human observation networks struggling to keep pace with updated projections. Whatever civilization, or force, or intelligence lay behind that relentless expansion remained largely a mystery, indifferent to every attempt at communication, utterly unmoved by the growing defensive presence gathering to meet it. Captain Marsh stood beside me at the command station, her expression calm despite the obvious weight pressing down on everyone present. Commander Ashworth occupied the position across from us, coordinating final preparations alongside his own senior staff, the two command structures working in tandem with a fluency that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. Final estimates place initial contact within the next several days, Ashworth said, addressing the assembled officers with the same calm, measured tone I remembered from our very first encounter. Our combined forces are as prepared as circumstances allow. Whatever comes next, we face it together. I glanced around the command outpost, taking in the mixture of coalition and human officers working side by side, communication barriers largely overcome through months of dedicated effort, old suspicions gradually replaced by genuine camaraderie born from shared purpose. Ilrin worked closely alongside a human counterpart at the communications station, both of them monitoring incoming data streams with focused concentration. Bresson coordinated defensive positioning alongside a human tactical officer, their combined experience creating strategies neither species could have developed alone. It was not the galaxy I had grown up believing in, one where humanity remained safely confined to childhood legend, distant and irrelevant to daily coalition life. Nor was it the galaxy some had feared during those early chaotic weeks following my first encounter, one dominated by an unstoppable, hostile force intent on conquest. It was something far more complicated, far more uncertain, but also, I had come to believe, far more hopeful than either extreme. 3 days later, the first contact reports began arriving from our forward observation posts, confirming what months of careful preparation had anticipated. The expanding threat had reached the outer edge of coalition territory, its advance forces engaging our joint defensive line with the same indifferent, mechanical efficiency described in earlier intelligence reports. The battle that followed tested every ounce of preparation both civilizations had invested over the preceding months. I watched from the command outpost as coordinated fleets, human and coalition vessels moving in practiced formation, met the advancing threat with a unified response that would have been utterly impossible without the fragile trust painstakingly built between our two peoples. The engagement stretched across hours that felt like days, tension gripping everyone present as reports streamed in from across the defensive line. Losses occurred on both sides, the cost of defending against such an overwhelming, indifferent force proving steep despite months of careful preparation. Yet through it all, the coordinated response held, human technological advantage combining with coalition strategic depth to create a defense stronger than either civilization could have mounted alone. By the time the advancing force finally withdrew, its initial assault repelled, though clearly not defeated entirely. Exhaustion and cautious relief swept through the command outpost in equal measure. We had held the line, but everyone present understood clearly that this engagement represented only the opening exchange in what would likely become a much longer, more difficult conflict. Captain Marsh addressed the assembled officers shortly after the engagement concluded, her voice carrying the exhausted resolve of someone who understood the significance of what had just occurred. "Today, we proved something important," she said. "Not that we are invincible, because we are not. Not that this threat is defeated, because it clearly is not. But we proved that cooperation between our civilizations can succeed, where isolation alone would surely have failed." Commander Ashworth stepped forward beside her, addressing the room with equal weight. "The road ahead remains long and uncertain, but we no longer face it as strangers, separated by fear and legend. We face it as allies, bound by shared purpose and hard-earned trust." As the following weeks unfolded, word of the successful joint defense spread rapidly across coalition space, reaching populations who had spent months anxious and uncertain about the mysterious threat looming beyond their borders. The narrative surrounding humanity shifted rapidly in public perception, the old fearful legends slowly giving way to a more complicated, nuanced understanding of a species that had chosen difficult, deliberate silence for generations, only to return precisely when the galaxy needed them most. I found myself reflecting often on how far the situation had evolved since that first tense encounter aboard my old patrol cruiser, when a single unidentified vessel had shattered every comfortable assumption I once held about humanity's fate. What began as fear and confusion had gradually transformed into something far more valuable, a genuine partnership built through shared sacrifice and mutual respect. However imperfect and still evolving that partnership remained. During a quiet moment aboard the command outpost, following another long day of coordinating ongoing defensive preparations, Captain Marsh found me standing near the observation deck, staring out at the stars stretching endlessly beyond the viewport. "You've come a long way since that first encounter," she said, settling beside me with the easy familiarity months of shared experience had built between us. "I suppose I have," I admitted, though I still find myself thinking about that voice, calm and patient, delivering a warning I barely understood at the time. It feels like a different lifetime now. "In many ways it was," Marsh said thoughtfully. "The galaxy you knew before that encounter no longer exists. Not entirely. Something new is being built in its place, uncertain and difficult as that process remains." I considered her words carefully, thinking about everything that had unfolded since that first tense sensor alert weeks, that now felt like years ago. The legends I had grown up believing, stories of a vanished, dangerous species meant to frighten restless younglings into obedience, had proven only partially true. Humanity had indeed possessed strength, significant enough to justify the fear woven through those old stories. But that strength, I now understood, had never been the true nightmare threatening the galaxy. The true nightmare remained the relentless, indifferent force, still advancing somewhere beyond our defensive line, patient and utterly unconcerned with whatever alliance we managed to build in response. Humanity's return, terrifying as it had first appeared, represented not the galaxy's greatest threat, but perhaps its greatest chance at survival, against something far more dangerous still waiting ahead. As I stood there beside Captain Marsh, watching the stars stretch endlessly before us, I found myself thinking not of the fear that had once defined humanity's legend across 1,000 different worlds, but of the quiet, determined resolve I had witnessed these past months. Human and coalition forces, standing together against a threat neither civilization could hope to face alone. The galaxy had spent generations telling stories about a species they believed extinct, warning children away from legends built on fear and misunderstanding. Now, standing at the edge of an uncertain future, I understood those stories had never captured the full truth. Humanity had not returned to bring the galaxy's nightmare. They had returned because the true nightmare was already coming, patient and indifferent, drawing closer with each passing day. And somewhere in the quiet resolve, shared between two civilizations once separated by fear and legend, I found myself believing, cautiously but genuinely, that together we finally stood a chance. The stars stretched on before us, vast and silent, holding whatever answers still remained hidden in the uncertain future ahead. Whatever came next, I understood clearly that we would face it not as strangers bound by old fear, but as allies bound by hard-earned trust, standing together at the edge of the unknown. And for the first time since that first, terrifying encounter weeks turned months ago, I found myself looking toward that uncertain future, not with dread, but with quiet, determined hope.